What's going on, everybody? Anthony Servino here with the Face Off Sports Network with my top starts and sits at the wide receiver position for NFL Week 10. Last week was a bumpy week when it comes to my wide receiver picks. And to be real, wide receivers, they've been hit or miss for me this year. I'm more of a running backs guy, and my running back starts and sits, which you can find in the archives, have been much more fruitful. But again, we're going to recap last week, and we have to try to be better. Chris Olave, we know, suffered that concussion, was knocked out of the game early. He was a start. Josh Downs finishes with 12 PPR points. He was another start. And Xavier Worthy in his smash matchup finishes with -1 point. So, yeah, that was a fun one on Monday Night Football. Meanwhile, DeAndre Hopkins goes off. My sits, Jalen Waddle, 7.6 PPR points. That was a hit. Amari Cooper ended up being an inactive player, does not play. So this is a wash. And then my one big miss was Jerry Jeudy, who ends the week with 14.3 PPR points. So we, with the starts and sits, we have players who did not play or left the game early with injury. We have hits, and then we have misses. So a pretty even week, a pretty weird week. But it is time to improve. Let's move to this week's picks. We're going to start with Brian Thomas Jr. And Brian Thomas Jr., the rookie, he's outstanding. He's proven durable. He's playing through this chest injury. It is a watered down wide receiver room in Jacksonville because of all of the injuries to guys like, Gabe Davis. He's dealing with the shoulder. We know Christian Kirk is done for the year. And Brian Thomas and Parker Washington, they're your two top guys right now. And Brian Thomas, for the first time, really in a long time, had a down week for his fantasy football managers last week against Philly. He only had 4 targets, hauling in 2 for 22. What's significant is that his target share is kind of going in the wrong direction. In the past 3 games, under 5 targets in each. But what has saved him in weeks 7 and 8, where he's given us 15 and 20 PPR points, is that he's hauling them in, getting yards and scoring touchdowns. That did not happen last week. And on paper, Philly looks like a good matchup, but they are an ascending defense, notably in their secondary. So we're going to go back this week to Brian Thomas Jr. Listen, he's the team leader in targets. He's getting 19.5% of them, which is 83rd percentile at the wide receiver position, while he's being targeted on 21.7% of the routes he is running. And he is also averaging 2.44 yards per route run, which is a whopping 94th percentile at his position. So it's all there. We just need Brian Thomas to begin clicking again. And it should happen this week against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, we have to put the disclaimer in there. Trevor Lawrence is dealing with an injury. There's a chance he might not play. But I'm still comfortable starting Brian Thomas Jr. Why? Number one, the matchup against Minnesota, on paper, they're the easiest matchup for enemy wide receivers. They are giving up a lot to the position. They are giving up double-digit PPR points every single game to at least one wide receiver. And if a wide receiver begins to click, if an offense clicks in this matchup, they're getting gashed. We've seen guys like Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell all account for double-digit PPR points. We've seen Green Bay receivers, Wicks and Reed, both pop for 24 each. We've seen Garrett Wilson-Lazard, both in the double digits. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Khalif Raymond in the double digits. Rams receivers, Kupp and Demarcus Robinson and Nakua, all in the double digits a few weeks ago. So we know you can throw on this secondary. Even if there's a backup quarterback, I'm still going Brian Thomas. Here's another reason why. Game script. We're going to safely assume that the Minnesota Vikings are going to beat up on the Jacksonville Jaguars and their descending defense, which means there's going to be a lot of garbage time. There's going to be garbage time targets, not only for guys like Parker Washington, but especially for guys like Evan Ingram and Brian Thomas Jr. So we're going to start Brian Thomas Jr. I think he brings a safe floor to the table, but I also think he could potentially get loose, get back into the end zone, and give us a quality fantasy game. Let's go to my next start, Darnell Mooney. And what do we know? We know that Drake London is up in the air this week. He is dealing with an injury suffered in last week's win versus Dallas, where he was knocked out of the game early. But Darnell Mooney, he is really coming on in this offense. And if London sits, Mooney is going to be the locked and loaded wide receiver one in this offense. This year, he's getting targeted 23.9% on his own team. He's also being targeted on 22.1% of the routes he is running. And he is averaging 1.91 yards per route run. He's also getting a ton of air yards, 90.3 per game, which is 91st percentile at his position. We know Mooney's a big play threat. Anytime he catches the ball, he's a speedster, and he's also getting some volume. He's had at least 8 targets in 2 out of his past 3 games. And when it comes to fantasy production, since week 2, he's given us at least 14.6 PPR points in all but 3 games. And he's on a 2-game streak in which he accounted for 86 yards and a touchdown and at least 18.6 PPR points. He's going to roll that success into a really good matchup against the New Orleans Saints. And what do we know about the Saints? Well, they just traded away their top corner in Marshawn Lattimore. So this defense, if they had any hope in shutting down an enemy passing attack, it's gone. Marshawn Lattimore's out of town, which opens things up even more so for Kirk Cousins and this explosive Atlanta Falcons throwing attack. I'm all in on Darnell Mooney this week. Whether or not Drake London plays, the matchup is there, the production is there, and there's enough volume where we should see Darnell Mooney pop once again for at least 18 fantasy points. I think that's a floor for him this week. That's how good this matchup is. Let's move on to our next and final start. I'm going to the Tank Dell well. Now, Tank Dell, what do we know about what's going on with the Houston Texans? Well, we're expected to see Nico Collins return to the field, and I believe that elevates Tank Dell because Nico Collins will once again draw the elite coverage, the double coverage, the bracket coverage. Tank Dell has been pretty solid, filling in for not only Nico while he's been out, but we also know Stephon Diggs is done for the year while he's been out in 3 out of 4 games. And this is after a terrible start of the year. In 3 out of the past 4 games, Tank Dell is coming alive with at least 13.5 PPR points, 2 of which he's gone for over 18.6. In both games where he had at least 18.6, he's also had at least 9 targets, 57 yards. This past week against the Jets, he does not find the end zone, but he goes for 126 yards, his first pop game yardage-wise of the season. So Tank Dell is starting to show that rapport with C.J. Stroud. We're expecting to get Nico Collins back. And what a game for it to come, for them all to come back together because they get the Detroit Lions. Some think that Lions are the best team in football. And they might be. But you can beat the Lions throwing the football. On paper, they have one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL. They're ranked 30th when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. Now, the Lions, we've seen them play well in some of these matchups recently, notably against Dallas. Dallas couldn't get anything going on them. We've seen them kind of limit the Packers throwing attack last week, but we've also seen some holes. Remember Calvin Ridley, the guy who couldn't get going? Well, 2 weeks ago, Calvin Ridley went for 143 yards on this secondary. We've seen Justin Jefferson pop on this secondary. We've seen Kupp and Godwin all go off earlier this year on this secondary. So there's production to be had. And I expect a shootout in this game, right? Both teams are fairly evenly matched offensively. You got Mixon and you got Detroit's running backs. We know Jared Goff and company can throw the football. They're getting Jameson Williams, their explosive playmaker, back. Same thing on the Texan side. They're getting Nico. They got Mixon. They got Dell. There's a lot of explosive firepower, and I believe both defenses have holes. While both defenses are good at stuffing the run, their secondaries are suspect. I'm expecting points, and if we see those points, if we see a back and forth slugfest between two of the best teams in the NFL, then I think Tank Dell is going to return outstanding fantasy production. Remember, if you like content like this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the alert icon so you can be notified anytime we are live to answer your questions, or we drop video content just like this. If you have start sit questions, waiver questions, or trade questions, ask them in the comment section below. We will get back to you as soon as we can. Let's start closing this baby out with some of my sits. We're going to start with the aforementioned Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley seems like he's coming on a little bit, right? Terrible year. Back-to-back games now, at least 12.3 PPR points. And of course, I just talked about it. He popped against the Lions for 10 catches, 143 yards 2 weeks ago. I don't think that's going to happen this week. You know, there's a lot of moving parts here where, okay, Ridley exploits the Lions. Ridley exploits a little bit the Patriots, right? 12.3 fantasy points. I wouldn't call that exploiting New England. He went 5 for 73. Pretty solid day on 8 targets. Things are going to get tougher, right? Because while Calvin Ridley, right, we can read off the metrics. He's getting 25% of the team targets. There's no more DeAndre Hopkins. He's getting 110 air yards per game. The issue is he has a 6.8% drop rate and a 45.8% catch rate. Both of them, that's 21st percentile drop rate, and that is 6th percentile catch rate. Those are amongst the league's worst of qualifying wide receivers. There is a misconnection and a disconnection with Ridley and Mason Rudolph and Ridley and Will Levis, and it's just not good in that passing attack right now for Tennessee. And now they get the Chargers. The Chargers are one of the best defenses in the NFL. They stuff the run. They contain the pass really, really well. They don't give up a lot of points. And quite frankly, they don't give up a lot of yards. And now Calvin Ridley has to face this defense. And I get it. Like the Chargers, they were a little bit leaky last week. We saw Judy and Tillman both go for double-digit PPR points. We've seen Chris Olave go for 18 a week before that. But I think those are outliers where if we look deeply into the numbers, in the past 3 games, the average NFL team is giving up 30.8 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That's the league average in the past 3 games. The Chargers in the past 3 games are giving up 27.1, which is a negative 12% differential. Let's go a little further. On the season, the NFL average, 32.3 points per game to wide receivers. The Chargers are at 26.8. That is a negative 17.2% differential. The Chargers are the real deal, and I don't think they have enough of firepower on the Titans side to give this defense fits, especially throwing the football. We're sitting Calvin Ridley with confidence. Next up, Marvin Harrison Jr. This is another player who looked like he was turning the corner 2 weeks ago in a tough matchup against Miami. He goes off 6 catches, 111 yards, a touchdown, 7 targets. The metrics are all there for this guy too. 22.4% of his team targets, but a 50.9% catch rate. That's another 16th percentile wide receiver. The connection is not there between Marvin and Kyler Murray, which is why he's getting the targets. We're not getting the production on a week-to-week basis. I think last week's or 2 weeks ago, that game against Miami, that's an outlier. Because if you take that away, he's gone for single-digit PPR points in every game since week 5, outside of that aforementioned week 8 game against Miami. And these are all tough defenses that they're playing. Now, the Cardinals offense, they're doing enough for them to win games. In fact, they're a first place team, but they're doing most of their damage on the ground with James Conner. We saw Benson get into the mix last week. We know Kyler's been running better this year. And now this week, Marvin Harrison Jr. gets the New York Football Jets. Right now, they're the number 1 team, the number 1 defense when it comes to fantasy points allowed. 2 wide receivers. The Jets are playing really good football right now on both sides of the ball. I get it was 1 game, but it looks promising. Defensively, they don't really give up a lot. They let Dell go off for 126. They shut down New England receivers. We saw in week 7 Pickens go off. But really, outside of that, they've been a quality defense. And we just talked about the Chargers and their numbers. Well, in the past 5 games, NFL average is 32.5 fantasy points to wide receivers per game. The Jets are at 24.5, which is a negative 24.5% differential. And Marvin is going to be blanketed by some elite cornerback help in New York, in Sauce Gardner. There's not many corners in the NFL better than this guy, and I think Sauce Gardner is going to really give Marvin Harrison Jr. fits. We're sitting the rookie in week 10. Let's close this out with Michael Pittman Jr. Now, Michael Pittman Jr., we thought we were going to get an uptick in production with Joe Flacco on the field, and it's not there yet. And right now, to be quite honest, I believe Josh Downs, if you're watching the games and if you're looking at the numbers, Josh Downs is operating as a number 1 wide receiver on the football field. Michael Pittman has now gone under 6 targets in 4 straight games, 3 of which he's gone under 5 targets. In 3 straight games, he's been under 9.3 PPR points and 6 games total in the single digits. He is by far one of the bigger busts at the wide receiver position this year. While things can turn around, I don't see it happening this week, and I don't really see it happening the next week either. You get Buffalo, who are 6th against wide receivers this week, and then in week 11, the New York Football Jets. We just talked about how good that defense is. I don't trust Joe Flacco. And if they turn back to Anthony Richardson, I don't trust him either. This is another wide receiver, Michael Pittman, with a horrendous 52.6% catch rate, 18th percentile. So while he's getting some targets, right, 22% of the team targets, he's not bringing them in. There's another disconnection here between wide receiver and quarterback. I don't like the matchup in Buffalo. I think if the Colts are going to have a chance of winning this one, it's going to be a Jonathan Taylor-dominated game on the ground. Otherwise, this could get ugly. We are sitting Michael Pittman in week